On April the 28th, 1789, a mutiny broke out on a Royal Navy vessel sailing in the South Pacific Ocean. The renegade group, led by Acting Lieutenant Fletcher Christian, seized the ship and placed the captain, Lieutenant William Bligh, and 18 others in the ship's open launch, setting them adrift in the vast ocean. These events have long become iconic. The mutiny on the Bounty captured the imagination in the 18th century and continues to do so today. 3 separate films and countless books have dramatized the takeover of the HMS Bounty, but far less is known about what happened next. While Bligh and his companions were eventually picked up and returned to England, Christian and his band of outlaws settled on a small island 1,929 kilometers, or 1,198 miles west of Easter Island, along with several Tahitian women they had picked up along the way. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it wasn't long before alcoholism, egoism, greed, and plenty of disease set in. It wasn't until September the 17th, 1814, that a British ship finally arrived, hoping to seize any remaining mutineers. But by that point, only one man remained, John Adams, and he was quickly granted clemency. The descendants of those who stormed the HMS Bounty in 1789 can still be found on Pitcairn Island in overseas British territory, and it is, in many ways, an idyllic tropical location. However, in 1999, an investigation began that would eventually shatter any semblance of paradise in the Pacific. Now, the scariest thing about this entire dark episode was how easily it was nearly missed. In 1999, a visiting UK police officer, Gail Cox, was taken to one side by a woman on Pitcairn and told that a young girl on the island had been raped. This set in motion an investigation that would eventually reach around the world, as well as delve back decades into the island's murky past. The Pitcairn Sexual Assault trial, held in 2004, finally lifted the veil on decades of systemic abuse in an area of the globe far from conventional oversight. It was a landmark legal case that captured the world's attention, shedding light on a small island and isolated community, raising complex questions about law, culture, and sovereignty. At the time of the trials, the island was home to just 47 people, mostly descendants of those initial mutineers. It was, and still is, a closely knit and secluded society that came under intense international scrutiny when allegations of sexual assault and misconduct surfaced involving some of the most high-ranking officials on the island. 7 men, that's already 14.8% of the entire population of the island, were put on trial and together faced a combined 55 charges relating to sexual offences against children and young women. So, when allegations first emerged, Operation Unique, an investigation run from New Zealand, spoke to every female who had lived on the island in the last 20 years, as well as all of the accused. Evidence was also gathered from those who had visited and spent time within the community. This early period saw the island's first conviction, which was carried out separately from Operation Unique. In 1999, a New Zealander visiting the island, Ricky Quinn, was sentenced to 100 days in prison for underage sex with a 15-year-old Pitcairn girl. Australian Seventh-day Adventist pastor Neville Towson lived on the island at that time and reported seeing widespread signs of abuse of girls on Pitcairn. When he attempted to bring this up with the island's council, he was told firmly the age of consent has always been 12 and it doesn't hurt them. If you look back through the records, the vast majority of girls who had grown up on Pitcairn did have their first child between 12 and 15. The investigation's findings pointed to a culture where underage sex and sexual abuse were ingrained and to some extent accepted practices, shielded by the community's tight-knit nature and geographical isolation. Now, these societal norms on Pitcairn had evolved in a way that allowed men to exploit their power and engage in sexual activities with minors without fear of repercussion. The investigation, which gradually grew in scale, involved interviewing numerous women who had left the island and resided in places like New Zealand, Australia, and England, uncovering a shocking number of disclosures. The allegations involved claims of rape, indecent assault, and gross indecency, some dating back decades. In 2004, charges were brought against 7 men living on the island and 6 more living abroad, encompassing a significant portion of the island's male population. The trial that would split Pitcairn was now set. A trial of this scope and in such a unique location was never going to be straightforward. While under British sovereignty, Pitcairn Island had its own set of laws influenced by its historical and geographical isolation. However, British law was also applicable, creating a rather murky legal landscape. One of the most contentious issues was whether British law could be imposed on a community that had been isolated for centuries and had developed its own customs and practices, some of which were at odds with modern British legal standards. The defendants argued that they were unaware that British laws, including those regarding sexual consent, applied to them. They also claimed that the island's sexual norms and the age of consent were different, reflecting their unique cultural context. You might think these arguments sound entirely absurd, and in many ways they were, but this was a legal minefield, and it raised serious questions about imposing external legal standards on isolated communities. The trial was initially supposed to be held in New Zealand, but the accused successfully argued for their case to be moved to Pitcairn Island. The trial itself was nothing short of extraordinary. It required the construction of a special courthouse and the importation of legal personnel from New Zealand and the UK. The population of Pitcairn doubled during this period, and the logistics of holding a trial in such a remote location were daunting, involving complex arrangements for transportation, accommodation, and communication. But it wasn't just the logistics that were unique. Pitcairn is tiny. It's about half the size of Disney World in Florida, with limited resources and accommodation options. It meant that everybody involved in the trial, from the accused to the prosecution, judges, and even journalists, were thrown together in a ludicrously small area. Only 6 journalists travelled to Pitcairn to cover the trial, and all wrote about the unique nature of covering such an important story while living among those most affected. Shortly after arriving, the journalists were invited to the home of Olive Christian, the wife of Steve Christian, mayor of the islands, and one of the 7 Pitcairn-based defendants accused of child sex offences. There, the journalists were greeted by a group of women, each of whom was related to at least one of the accused. It quickly became clear this was no normal meet and greet. The media had been invited to hear a passionate defence of the accused men on Pitcairn. They were told in no uncertain terms that the legal age of consent had always been 12 and that all of the accusers knew exactly what they were doing. They also asserted that the entire scandal had been cooked up as a plot to close the island down because it had become a financial burden on the UK. Their trump cards were 2 women who had initially said they would give evidence, but after thinking it through had decided against it. One of which now claimed that she had been dragged to the police station and offered money to testify, though it seems this actually related to statutory compensation and not a bribe. Pitcairn, a tiny mini-state with a population of 47, was divided in 2. One group supported the accused wholeheartedly and believed that the trial was entirely fabricated as a way of subjecting colonial subjects to the will of the overlord. The other side saw the actions of the accused as reprehensible and agreed that there was indeed systemic misogynistic violence that most of the island's men had grown up with. So, one of the strangest trials in UK history began on the 30th of September 2004. The accused was Stephen Raymond Christian, the island's mayor, and his son, Randy Christian, chairman of the powerful Internal Committee. Then Carlisle Brown, Steve Christian's father-in-law, and his son, Dave Brown, as well as Dennis Ray Christian, Carlisle Terry Young, and Jay Warren, former magistrate of the Pitcairn Islands from 1990 to 1999. The proceedings were conducted very much under a global gaze. While there may have been just 6 journalists on the ground, the world was gripped by this highly unusual trial that was unfolding in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean. Testimonies, all given via video link from New Zealand, were harrowing, with victims recounting their experiences of abuse, often at a very young age. The defence's argument that the island's cultural norms justified the behaviour was met with skepticism and outrage, particularly from advocates for sexual assault victims. Some of the stories recounted in court related to a child as young as 5 or 6, which clearly flew in the face of the islanders' claims that no girl was ever touched before the age of 12. To complicate this entire process even more was a factor that had basically never needed to be considered. What happens to a small island when half of the men are all imprisoned at once? The question of who would man the longboats that connected the island to the outside world appeared to weigh very heavily on everybody involved. Would this serve as collective punishment that every person on Pitcairn Island would need to pay? 6 of the 7 accused were found guilty on the 26th of October 2004, with only Jay Warren proven innocent. Sentences ranged from community service to prison terms, with Mayor Steve Christian, Randy Christian, Len Brown, and Carlisle Terry Young all being given sentences ranging from 2 to 6 years. Dave Brown and Dennis Ray Christian were sentenced to 400 and 300 hours of community service, respectively. The length of the sentences immediately led to an outcry that convicted rapists could be given such lenient sentences, but it was clear that the judge's ruling had taken into account the unique situation. It was also evident to everybody involved that while many actions were undeniably heinous and illegal, Pitcairn had developed in ways completely different from the UK. Men and women were sexually active at a much earlier age than practically every Western nation deems acceptable today. While undoubtedly there were stories of absolute horror, there were also tales of infatuation, romance, and affairs, which meant that some of the charges were eventually dropped or remained unproven. The trials and subsequent appeals, which upheld most of the convictions, revealed the extent of the abuse and the profound challenges in applying external legal standards to an isolated community with its own distinct cultural practices. It led to a re-evaluation of Pitcairn Island's legal and governance structures, with reforms implemented to ensure better alignment with international human rights standards. The case also prompted a broader discussion about the protection of children and the prevention of sexual abuse in isolated communities worldwide. The Pitcairn Sexual Assault trial was a complex case that defied easy categorization. It highlighted the tension between respecting cultural practices and enforcing universal human rights standards. Do those in the modern Western world have the right to impose their views on how society should operate? For the people of Pitcairn, the trial was a traumatic event that exposed deep divisions within the community. It forced a reckoning with a past that many would have preferred to have left unexamined. For the wider world, the trial served as a reminder of the hidden abuses that can occur in isolated communities and the difficulties in bringing the perpetrators to justice. The uncomfortable truth is that there are many areas of the world where our standards and social norms simply don't apply. Child brides are still sadly prevalent in many countries, and you don't need to dig down too far to find places where our normalized idea of basic human rights are thrown completely out of the window. The Pitcairn sexual case was a sordid, scandalous episode that the media lapped up, but this kind of thing happens practically every day to millions of people around the world.